What do Tractor Supply, Neiman Marcus, Johnson & Johnson, Dow, Lego, Northrop Grumman, and dozens of other companies all have in common? They are all a part of the Future of Work Leaders community. This is a global community of the world's top people leaders shaping the future of work and employee experience. If you're interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today, Jim Sebenius, professor of business administration at Harvard, and he also directs the Harvard Negotiation Project at the Harvard Law School. Jim, thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So this is a really interesting topic for me. I've had one other expert in negotiation on this podcast, and that was Chris Voss, who he was, I believe it was a FBI or CIA negotiator. And
FBI.
FBI, and I'm always really interested in this topic because, especially in the context of work and business, negotiation is a huge component, whether you're trying to negotiate for a raise or a change management project or whatever it is. But before we get started, why don't you just give us a little bit of background information about you and some of the cool things that you've been involved in, and then we'll jump right into some of the questions I have for you.
Sure. So my background, in college was math, English, and mostly debating, which I spent an awful lot of time doing. Then I was out at Stanford's engineering school where I did a master's. I then did an internship in Washington, which ended up being much more involved. Worked in the Commerce Department and then the State Department, and ended up finishing up a PhD in business economics, which is really economics, game theory, and finance at Harvard. I started teaching there and taught for about 4 years. Before I was just getting a little antsy because I'd had some terrific jobs in the government, and I went to Wall Street. And so I initially was taking a job with Pete Peterson, who at the time was chairman and CEO of Lehman. He got kicked out in a management succession battle. Said, "Jim, I like you. The job's still open, but it's not at Lehman. Are you interested in more entrepreneurial experience?" And I said, "Sure." And he ransomed Steve Schwartzman out of his non-compete at Lehman, and that was the start of Blackstone. So I was at Blackstone for the first few years. And really, I thought I was changing, careers entirely. It was a fascinating time for somebody interested in negotiation. And I did that, and I enjoyed it immensely. But as we began to have a family and the idea of actually beginning to know and have good extended relationships with my kids and my spouse, and actually deciding that I enjoyed creating intellectual capital and I enjoyed teaching. So I also at the time, there were a lot of people on Wall Street going to jail, and that seemed like a really bad idea.
Yeah.
So I found my way back to Harvard and helped us and basically started the negotiation department at the business school. Hired a bunch of people, some psychologists, some lawyers, some economists, some game theorists, and we've turned negotiation into a course that's one of the most popular ones at the school. And I also teach across the university, some at the law school, and then of course not on the business side of things, but on negotiation and diplomacy across the university. And one of the things that might interest your listeners is the program on negotiation is a consortium of MIT, the professional schools at Harvard, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and some other Boston area schools. And every year or so, we honor a quote unquote great negotiator, and we bring them to write cases on them, bring them to campus, and so forth. And so we've done that. I've chaired that program for over 20 years, and really brought some absolutely remarkable negotiators from the public and private sectors there, starting with George Mitchell for his work in Northern Ireland, people like financiers like Bruce Wasserstein, artists like Christo and Jean-Claude and their outside art, and and people who stopped wars. It's just fascinating. In addition to my normal, everyday case writing, which I do at the business school regularly. So I kind of have a nice foot in the world of theory and very much in the world of practice. And like most of my colleagues, spend about 20% of my time on outside stuff. I'm always working on deals, always got at least a couple of deals going, which keeps me sharp and makes sure that my research and teaching are actually valuable and worthwhile in practice. So that's kind of what keeps me going. And I started a podcast recently on the basis of all these great negotiators that we've interviewed, sometimes for 2 or 3 days on videotape. It's called Dealcraft: Insights from Great Negotiators. And actually, what's interesting is the executive programs that we've done on negotiation have kind of morphed. And they're now actually called negotiation and leadership
Hmm.
and that's where I think there's a nice linkage between when I look at the topics that your podcast has featured. Leadership really figures. I mean, it's core to what you do, and the relationship between negotiating and leading is very close in practice and increasingly in theory. Theory sometimes takes a while to catch up with practice, but in any case, it'd be fun to explore that topic with you.
Yeah, definitely, because I agree. There's a lot of overlap. But why don't we start with? I'm curious who you think some of the greatest negotiators of all time are, because to me, a few come to mind. Somebody like a Warren Buffett, a Steve Jobs comes to mind. Bob Iger, the way that he negotiated Pixar and Lucasfilm and Marvel. So many really interesting insights. I finished reading his book not that long ago, The Ride of a Lifetime, which is really interesting the way he was able to structure deals. A lot of people would probably put someone like a Donald Trump in that category with his book, The Art of the Deal, all about negotiation. So, who are some of your favorite negotiators? And you're more than welcome to throw in people from the political side. I know you did work with Henry Kissinger, or from the business side, but I'd love to hear who's a negotiator that you think is amazing, and then we'll talk about why are they so good? What techniques did they implement? What made them such a negotiating force?
Right. Well, there are a lot of really great negotiators, and among those whom you named, I think it's interesting because if you think of a Warren Buffett, he's a spectacular investor, but sometimes he had to step into the businesses, like for Solomon Brothers and others, and really manage them. And it wasn't just a matter of giving orders, it was a matter of really a lot of negotiation with external stakeholders and internal players and so forth that he was able to pull off. And my sense of Bob Iger is he is absolutely in the category of some of the best negotiators I'm familiar with. Those 3 deals that you mentioned, also buying the Fox Studios business, which was really pretty
Yeah.
remarkable. The only thing that I think he messed up on was his succession plan, which, Bob Chapek turned out to be the wrong guy, and he's back in, and I think they're trying to do it more successfully this time. But what I was really struck with Iger, for example, is how he really tries to build his negotiations build on one another.
Hmm.
So there was a pretty lousy relationship that his predecessor, Michael Eisner, had with Steve Jobs, and yet the Pixar Disney relationship was very important. And he kind of had to turn that around with a lot of relationship building and a lot of kind of understanding back and forth as they brought Pixar into Disney and did it in a way um, that seemed to honor the creativity of the Pixar people and give
Yeah.
them reign and also the resources of Disney. It made it much easier to then go to Lucasfilm and then like Perlmutter at Marvel, and I think each of them built on the other. And they haven't always worked out the way the people who were acquired had wanted. But I think that in general, that sense that negotiation isn't just a one-time thing that you draw a circle around and that's that, but that it really is a much more fluid and a process that's linked to others. Of the great negotiators in the that I've spent time with or studied carefully or others, I probably would say in the public sector, the 2 really impressive ones from my perspective, and there are many more, but I would say um, Jim Baker, who I indirectly worked for when I was in the government many years ago, and he was an oil and gas lawyer till he was 40.
Hmm.
And in Houston in the oil patch, and he basically did oil transactions, whether it was mergers or putting deals together of different kinds. His grandfather started a dominant law firm in Houston, and his grandfather said, "Study hard, work hard, and stay out of politics." And Baker, when he was 40, his first wife tragically died. He was left with four kids, four young sons. He thought he would become an alcoholic, he told us. And but his tennis buddy, George H.W. Bush, kind of drew him out of his funk. And then Baker got the political bug and managed five presidential campaigns and was Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State. And when I talk about him as a negotiator, his private negotiations were actually really impressive. But publicly,
Hmm.
putting the two Germanys together, East and West, within NATO was almost unthinkable at the time. The idea that the then Soviet Union would permit Germany to get together within the NATO umbrella took the most extraordinary kind of negotiation. And of course, obviously, Vladimir Putin thinks it was a disaster.
Yeah.
But I think but the process of doing that, of bringing the West Germans on board, and then the French, and then the English, and then and gradually then ultimately forming a relationship with Shevardnadze and then with Gorbachev, and then managing to pull that together was remarkable. And that finished just about the time that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And he, pulled together the political and military coalition to eject Saddam from Kuwait. And again, you can talk about some of the things that he did, and they were, really, really impressive. And and later the Madrid conference and so forth. The other great diplomat, I would say, somewhat surprisingly from my experience, was Henry Kissinger. And I say surprisingly because most people know Kissinger, well, people either write about him as he's a war criminal or he's a,
Yeah, I was gonna
brilliant
say that either
strategist.
he's got a, I
It's
love him or I hate him.
Yeah, it's no, and in the time that I sort of came of age, Kissinger and Nixon were not my heroes, but spending time with I mentioned these great negotiators, and when we honored Baker, we decided that we would also talk to all the former U.S. Secretaries of State, bring them to Harvard at different times, and focus on their most challenging negotiations. And we're interested enough with Kissinger, with his obviously negotiations in China and détente with the Soviet Union, arms control, the disengagement agreements between Egypt and Israel, just a whole series of things. So we looked at it through that lens and really found him to be truly impressive. Others on the private side, and I could say more about why these people were so good, but a couple on the private side, I was at Blackstone for the first several years. I'd left Harvard and then I eventually went back. But but really, Steve Schwartzman is a remarkable negotiator. Forbes called him, Wall Street's greatest steelmaker, and I was able to observe his negotiations up close when Blackstone was, six or eight people and nothing like the financial behemoth that it now is. And each of those negotiations were kind of make or break. And in fact, on the podcast that I mentioned, I went back a year and a half ago and asked Steve to just recount. Let's talk through all those early negotiations at Blackstone when everything was kind of on the line, and kind of seeing where, his what he ideally liked to do was become what he called a friend of the situation, and really try to figure out where a zone of fairness was, and then push things in that direction. But he could also play real hardball as needed,
Yeah.
and you could kind of see, and there are a number of really pretty interesting situations which were pivotal in the creation of the firm that we might talk about just in that. Others, recently I've gotten to know a remarkable music industry lawyer who's his name is John Branca, and he's had over 30 of his clients in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, going back from Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys on to Dr. Dre and and so forth. But his most famous client, depending on your point of view, was Michael Jackson.
Wow.
When he was 29, Jackson was 21 and coming out from under the thumb of his sort of tyrannical father. Branca was, he Jackson took a shine to Branca, who was a young lawyer. He'd been a musician. He'd opened for the Doors, dropped out of high school, and then decided he needed to go to law school because he wasn't going to make it as a musician, even though he had a major contract. And he was Jackson's on and off sort of business lawyer throughout his career, and did such remarkable things, including buying the Beatles catalog for him, out from under much richer and more powerful competitors, and ended up, Jackson over his lifetime made about $1 billion. Then he tragically died. Branca is a co-executor of the estate, which was $500 million in debt when Jackson died. And
Wow.
within 60 days of having the assets seized, he's probably turned those assets into about $3 billion with all sorts of remarkable deal making. And so it's whether it's the making of Thriller or these other things, these are, really very different. But I hope you can see one of the things I really enjoy about negotiation is it opens the door to all sorts of really interesting
Yeah.
people and subjects. And so, we could go on, but those are some of the pieces. And you asked me two questions. One was who they are, and the other is what they do.
Yeah,
And
that let's start
we can
with
certainly get into some of those pieces.
yeah, let's
Yeah.
start with Baker and Kissinger on kind of on the political side, and then we can move into the business side. So what made them such good negotiators? Were there similarities and differences in terms of their styles and approaches?
Yeah, their interpersonal styles are really quite different. But what I notice that's in common, you see in different people, they have a capacity, both of them, to sort of what you might say to zoom out
Okay.
and see the bigger picture, to have a kind of a strategic view, very analytical, and kind of a sense of the lay of the land and what this strategy implies about which negotiations will support it. And then they zoom in interpersonally to the people who will, who are necessary to persuade to go along with it. And they're constantly iterating between the strategic and the analytical, zooming out, and then zooming in to the people and the particulars. And what I've often seen of people who are sort of less talented, there's some people who are fantastic at sort of zooming out and the strategy, and they can really analyze the situation well. But interpersonally, they may just be klutzes. And other people are fantastic interpersonally, but they don't have a strategic bone in their body.
Hmm.
And what I've found the great negotiators is they sort of seamlessly iterate between zooming out and zooming in.
Well,
Now,
so
they
what
do
is?
different things.
Yeah, maybe you can unpack that a little bit more as far as the strategy and sort of the interpersonal, and maybe you can give an example so people can help determine if they
Yeah,
have those qualities or not as well.
sure. So we might use, I think we might use, if we take an example that has a little bit. Uh, I'm gonna diverge just slightly because I'm a big admirer of Chris Voss's, and I've read his book and seen a variety of things that he's done on the hostage negotiations. His advice tends to be really effective on high tension interpersonal situations,
Yes.
hostage negotiations, and sort of the business equivalent and so forth. And he's broader than that, but that's really his bread and butter. But that's the kind of the interpersonal side. When you look at a Kissinger or a Baker, for example, they spend a lot of time on what you might think of as the setup of the negotiation.
Hmm.
So that's how you get the right people involved in the right sequence to deal with the right set of issues by the right process, facing the right consequences in the event of no deal. So they're worried a lot about the architecture of the situation as well as the interpersonal piece. So an example that I might offer, again, we'll start with the political realm. We can certainly go to business and finance. But when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and and Jim Baker was tasked with building a political coalition sufficient to eject Saddam from Kuwait. And okay, so right away, and one of the negotiations he knew he was going to have to do was with the Congress because it was a Democratic Congress, Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. They were a Republican president. He was going to somehow need to get the authorization to use force in Kuwait. And it was pretty unlikely to get that because there was a sense that diplomacy really was the focus and there was no appetite for that. So how did he do this? And it's interesting because if you talk to Baker, you realize that so much of how you put a coalition together turns out to be important to do what I just said. Now, how do those things come together? Well, he he knew that if he went to the Congress and asked for authorization to use force to eject Saddam from Kuwait, the answer would be no. So he didn't go there. He didn't start that negotiation at all, but he went internationally. And if you ask most people about how you build a coalition, you'd say, well, first you get your ducks in a row, you negotiate internally. When you've got alignment, then you go externally. That really wouldn't have worked in this case. Second thing is you think you get your allies on board first, and then you kind of build around those allies, and until you've got a sufficiently powerful coalition. Well, Baker looked at the situation and didn't just follow the normal rules of thumb, because it's interesting. In fact, he didn't go to the Congress first, but he went externally. And who was probably the strongest U.S. ally in that region? It was probably Israel. But I think if he said if we get the Israelis on board, we'll never get the Arabs.
Hmm.
So what he basically did is he built a coalition with the moderate Arab states and the Europeans and others, and the Israelis were tacitly part of it, but not explicitly part of it. And after he built this coalition, then they went to the UN and the Security Council and got the resolution of all necessary means to eject Saddam from Kuwait. Only with the Security Council resolution did he then go to the Congress. And he told us of these really interesting negotiations where, for example, a senator from Ohio and he would say, we don't want to do this. And he would say, Senator, the president of Ethiopia is supporting the United States in this. We hope you'll be able to do so as well.
Yeah, that's
And,
interesting.
he was able to pull this together. So really, if you think about it, he said, I know I've got a tough negotiation. If I do it directly, it'll fail. And
Yeah.
if I get a no internally, I can never build the external.
Hmm.
So let's go external and build that, and then come back internally and pull this
Yeah, it
off.
reminds
And
me
what I
of,
think is interesting is you sort of, when you think about stakeholders or pulling these together,
yeah.
sequencing really matters, and the setup of the negotiation matters much more than the just going and being persuasive. And that's something you tend to see of both great business and political
Yeah, it
negotiators. I
reminds
don't know
me
if that
of,
helps to make it a bit more
it
tangible.
does, it does. It actually reminds me of chess. I play a lot of chess. People who listen to this podcast know I'm obsessed with chess. And, there's a concept in chess called intermediate moves. And the whole idea of an intermediate move in chess is that, when you're playing a game, um, a lot of chess players tend to go for kind of direct, like I'm being attacked, I should move. Checkmate
Hmm.
is being threatened, I should do this. But the concept of the intermediate move is there a move that I can play such that it forces my opponent to do something before I then play the intended move that I wanted to play? And so it
Yes.
seems like in this case, one of the things that Jim Baker was really good at is this idea of intermediate moves, where instead of going kind of direct, you have the opportunity to play a move first before you play the move that you intended to play, which, just visually makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if people don't play chess, they might think I'm out of my mind. But it very
Not
much
in,
reminds me of that idea.
not in the lead. It makes perfect sense to me. And it's interesting because one guy I never worked with him, but I did an extensive case on him. A guy named Steve Friedman. Steve
Mm.
actually brought the two separate. I mean, he created two separate divisions at Goldman Sachs. One before they had gone into private equity, he brought that in, and before that, instead of general corporate finance, he created a specialty on mergers and acquisitions. So he's pretty entrepreneurial within the firm. And then he later was managed and ran Goldman, and then had some government positions on the Council of Economic Advisors and the Intelligence Committee and so forth. And talking to Steve, he said something really interesting. He said, in terms of negotiation, he said, silver tongues and tactics can be a sideshow.
Hmm.
As chess masters know, success at the table flows from advanced preparation and strategically positioning your pieces to maximize leverage.
Yeah.
And so he's really talking about the same. And if you talk to George Schultz, who really a remarkable guy, he has a PhD from MIT. He taught there. He was then the dean of Chicago's business school. He went to Bechtel for a dozen years and rose to be number two at this, huge design, construction, build global firm.
Hmm.
Then he went into the government and was Secretary of Labor, and then later Secretary of State. Then out to Hoover. And when you talk to Schultz, you realize that this is a man who's just he passed away a year and a half ago at age 100. But this
Wow.
is a guy who brings such judgment to any question. And when he would talk about negotiations, so many interesting things that he would say. For example, it's remarkable what you can get someone to do if you don't insist that they do it. Now, this is interesting because he was talking about negotiations to let Jews out of the Soviet Union. And if it was necessary to get agreement of the then Soviet government to do this, it would never happen. But they could do a tacit negotiation and accomplish a great deal. And I've often found that when there's something difficult, this sort of comes to my mind. You know, if you could get, it's remarkable what you can get somebody to do if you don't force them to admit that they're doing it.
Yeah.
And you find this in a bunch of, it's a very pragmatic and actually kind of an interesting thing. And he also talks about what he calls tending the diplomatic garden, which
Mm,
is, just a sort of a metaphor for saying the importance of nurturing relationships is really key because those are essential assets in negotiation.
yeah.
And it's you can find these in in a variety of different areas. I many years ago or a number of years ago, the first book that I wrote when I was with a colleague, David Lax, we wrote a book called The Manager as Negotiator, and the idea was to sort of look at the job of a manager and a leader, frankly, as sort of nonstop negotiation, where command and
Mm,
authority are tools of persuasion, but that's not the primary way that you get people to do
yeah.
things. Because it's and it what's interesting is there's a little bit intellectual history that I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with, but it's in the late 1950s and early 60s, a professor at Harvard, Richard Neustadt, wrote a book called Presidential Power. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
No,
it,
no, not at all.
but it's an interesting book because it turned the field of political science
I'm gonna
and
look it up.
its conception of leadership on its head. It was very influential. In fact, it was especially influential because President Kennedy, who read it, um, in his inaugural speech, held up this book and
Mm.
said, "This is the essence of leadership." Now, that, of course, led to a lot of sales in Washington, D.C., as you might
Yeah,
imagine,
I
because
see the book
everybody
here.
wanted to know what this thing was.
Yeah, I just looked
Well,
it up on
here's the
Amazon. Maybe I'll have to buy it and
yeah.
read it.
Well, here in a nutshell, the reason that it was so striking to people is Newsat essentially said presidential
Mm,
power is the power to persuade and the power to bargain. And the image of the president was what? The commander in chief, right? You give orders and things happen. And he gave some examples. So, for example, when Truman fired MacArthur, that seems like a quintessential example of the president exerting power. And it is. But Neustadt actually looks at that, he steps back and says, actually, that was a failure of negotiation because he couldn't get MacArthur to do what he wanted to do. So he had to have he exercised his power, but it cost him a lot. It was a real hit politically.
mm.
And, and Truman, when he tried to seize the steel mills, for example, he was rebuffed by the courts. And actually, there, to seize the steel mills, you needed to work with the companies and the labor unions and otherwise to get them to do what you wanted. And it was, and he gave a whole bunch of examples of what looked like presidential power, which were actually failures of negotiation, and then a lot of other things that looked like presidential power, exercise. But in fact, when you look behind the curtain, there was enormous negotiation going on, and so it was kind of a flip of what people thought of. The commander in chief gives orders,
Yeah.
and the underlying reality was very different. And I think obviously in the business world, when you talk about that, this is, I think very common. It's not that command doesn't matter. It obviously does, but that's not the primary way that most people exert successful influence.
Mm.
I think your example of Bob Iger is a good one. There's no way to sort of order everybody around, and it's a wasting resource if you keep using it.
Yeah, the Bob Iger story was interesting because even I think when he was talking about negotiating the deal with Pixar, everybody on his team was telling him it's a bad idea. It doesn't make financial sense. It's not going to be profitable. Steve Jobs is never going to do it, this and that. And then he kind of went against from what I understand, he went against everybody else's ideas and feedback. And he went a lot with his intuition and gut and just kind of, what he thought about it and made the deal happen. And so I'm actually really curious as far as negotiation, how much of negotiating is that kind of intuition versus facts, data, analytics, preparation, technique, versus, again, going back to the chess analogy, sometimes you're on the chessboard and you play something that inspires you, you play something out of intuition. You don't necessarily calculate your way out of a position, but you just kind of feel that you should do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, my sense is that intuition and judgment end up playing a significant role in most successful negotiations because rarely does the data make it so clear to you what you should do or shouldn't do. There's almost always, uncertain aspects and you need to, but I think educated intuition informed by judgment is there. The Pixar example is a really interesting one because there had been a joint venture between Pixar and Disney, which frankly, Michael Eisner had acted in a way that really alienated Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
and they were frankly going to pull out of it. At the same time, the legendary animation studios of Disney had really fallen on hard times. They just were not turning out hits. And I think Iger understood that that Pixar had a formula and a way of doing this, not to mention their technology, that was that really could supercharge Disney's animation studios, which of course had been its traditional strength but wasn't there. And I think that from his perspective, that the idea of investing in creativity and technology on a global scale were the things that animated his overall strategy. So this aligned with his strategy, and I think that the cost of Pixar was high. Um, and in that sense, I think he went ahead. I think most people just thought it would never happen
Yeah.
because they thought, Jobs has such a powerful ego and he's been so successful despite all sorts of things that people said. There just didn't feel like Jobs could, be wooed into a corporate role. But Iger was able to persuade him that Pixar would have a pride of place and would be strengthened by acquisition by Disney and so forth.
Hmm.
And I think he was probably right. So it was a combination of intuition and strategy. And then they did pay more for it, no question. And they paid a lot more for
Yeah.
the Fox Studios. I think almost $70 billion for that. And I guess the jury's still out on where that goes because all this was supposed to feed their streaming, and streaming's been a tough road for Disney, especially with ESPN.
Yeah.
But that's another story. But it's no, I think there's a lot of intuition in this. But something that I might step back from a little bit, and when I think of negotiation, the parts of negotiation that are, I think, especially valuable for leaders who have a variety of stakeholders. When I think of negotiation, I think of setup, deal design, and tactics. And the tactical piece, the direct interpersonal interaction, how you meet objections, how you build trust, how you communicate clearly,
Hmm.
how these elements are really important. And I think, for example, Chris Voss is really good at that. I'm just impressed at his kind of psychological insight and his capacity to do those pieces. That's kind of the people side. Then there's what you might think of as the substantive side. And in the way I tend to look at negotiation, there's deal design. And deal design is the art and science of crafting agreements, whether it's a contract or in the public sector, a treaty or a memo of understanding or these pieces. But it's how you craft deals that unlock value and do so on a sustainable basis. And there are a lot of principles for effective deal design, because value is not just financial. If somebody cares about something, whether it's fairness, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a precedent, whether there's a range of things, but 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 a deal that unlocks and fosters that's valuable. So you have the people piece, you have the substantive piece or the deal design piece, and then what we've talked about before, which is the setup. All of the moves away from the table that align the situation such that once you're dealing with this group, you've got the best shot at overcoming
Yeah.
the barriers between you and what you're looking for. And a lot of times with stakeholders, that's what you're doing. And it's more like you might think of a negotiation campaign rather than just doing deals. In other words, you're moving toward an alignment of the purposes and strategy that you have, the support and authority, the political support and authority, I mean political small p and authority, and then the administration, which in classic administration says what? You align resources and accountability resources with responsibility. But I think anybody who's managed anything realizes that many times you don't have sufficient authority or resources to be responsible for the outcome.
Mm.
In fact, they're insufficient, and you're held accountable for much more than you really have explicit control over. What does that mean? You're going to have to negotiate. It's sort of like indirect management,
Yeah.
and you'll have to persuade people to go along with you. And I think that's pretty characteristic of what happens these days.
Are you a chief people officer or a chief human resource officer that is responsible for the future of work and employee experience? If so, then you're going to want to check out futureofworkleaders.com. It's a new global community that I am putting together of the world's top people leaders from brands including Neiman Marcus, Johnson & Johnson, Dow, Lego, Tractor Supply, Northrop Grumman, and dozens of others. If you're interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and again, if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. Yeah, very important for leaders. Just hearing you talk reminds me, I think it was 2-3 years ago, my wife and I went to Cancun to one of these nice resorts. And, one of the things they do when you go to these resorts, they say, hey, if you're willing to sit through one of our presentations, because they want you to try to get property there. If you're willing to sit through one of our presentations for a little bit, then we're going to give you like a $300 gift card to go to the spa. And so, I convinced my wife, I'm like, let's go do it. I love when people try to sell me because I also like negotiating and debating and like having these arguments.
Yeah.
My wife hates it. She's like, I don't want to waste my time in here. This is garbage. So anyway, I convinced her to go with me. We go up to this, this beautiful penthouse in the hotel, and we're greeted by this guy. And then my wife just looks at him and she's like, look, I'm going to be here for 30 minutes. You can talk for 30 minutes. After that, I'm leaving. My husband, he can stay if he wants to. And the guy was just like, whoa. So anyway, he proceeds to sell for 30 minutes. And then after a while, Blake's like, all right, I'm out of here. See you later. And then I told the guy I would stay a little bit. And, they're trying to get you to buy this property, and he's trying to
Sure.
all his little techniques and tactics. And I'm like, no, I'm good. And he's like, okay, hang on. Let me just get my manager to come in here to sign some paperwork that you showed up. And then after you sign that, you can leave and we'll give you the spa gift card. So he walks away, and in comes this other dude. And this guy's got like a Rolex watch on. He's wearing a suit and tie, professionally dressed, totally different demeanor. He's cleaned up. The guy looks like $1 million. And the conversation is totally different with him. And he busts out the like, you love your wife, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, this is like the fun kind of stuff.
Yeah. This is good stuff.
Yeah, and so we just went back and forth, and I'm like, honestly, you're a great salesperson. And I said, you should be training all the people that are here, but I'm just telling you right now, I'm not going to be buying this property from you, but I love, your whole thing.
Right.
And we ended up laughing about it and like shook hands, and he's like, thank you for coming. But it's just really interesting because you can tell that when you go into those types of things, they have like a process. They have a template. They know what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, to the point where the guy's literally, he's writing upside down because he has this piece of paper in front of me and he's trying to make charts and graphs and explain things to me, but he doesn't want to keep turning the paper back and forth. So he's done this
oriented toward you.
Yeah. So the paper's oriented toward me and he's writing upside down so that I can see everything right side up as he's writing it. And I'm just like, it's just so interesting, the process that some of these people have in negotiating and in sales. And I don't know, it just reminded me of, hearing you talk about the design and the psychological aspect that some people really, really think through this. I also remember a story. I interviewed Jim Fish. He's the CEO of Waste Management. Mm-hmm. And he was telling me this story where he was negotiating this really big project. And he was in a room, and he said, full of sharks. And these people wanted to rip his head off. These are like big time negotiators, lawyers, all these people that are just trying to take him for everything he has and chop up the company. And in the middle of the meeting, he had a tragedy happen where his sister called him and basically said, our mom passed away. And so he stepped out of the meeting, took the call, and came back in. And he's obviously visibly very upset. Yeah. And the people in the room, these negotiators, these sharks, are kind of like, do you want to postpone for another day? And he's like, no, it's fine. Let's just get through this. But he told me that tragedy and the fact that they were so empathetic and sympathetic to what had just happened to him allowed them to get through the negotiating process to the point where it kept them from fighting back and forth about every single issue. And they were just kind of like, that's fine, you can have that. And he told me that they spent a few minutes actually just talking about their families and how much their moms and their dads meant to them. And it's just really interesting how the circumstance and the situation can shape the negotiation. And so that's kind of a second thing that came to mind as you were talking about the
Well,
design and the setup.
yeah, particularly, I mean, that kind of getting it really, as you were describing kind of each of those things, that feels very much like the direct interpersonal dealing and how you orchestrate that. And it's you know, one of the kind of interesting sidelights of interviewing all these secretaries of state is that we asked them all kinds of things, but I asked a number of them about dealing with very, very hard bargainers
Mhm.
and who was among the hardest bargainer that they'd ever dealt with and what's their advice? And a name that consistently came up was Vladimir Putin. And
Not
so I,
surprised.
I said,
Not
I
surprised.
think that, I said, well, he's a good stand-in for hard bargainers. I think that's, so what's your advice? And so the first person, and actually, if someone had to deal with somebody like Vladimir Putin, of course you study up on him and so forth. But one of the best pieces of advice that came out of these conversations is the importance of talking to people who themselves have actually negotiated with the person that you're going to deal with.
Yeah.
And so, for example, asking Colin Powell, what would be your advice in dealing with Putin? He says, well, I dealt with him a lot, and I dealt with his, people here and so forth. And it was interesting because he comes at you, with cuts at you, those blue eyes and KGB through and through and so forth. And, however, when we needed to do something, if he saw that there wasn't really an escape, he could turn on a dime,
Mm.
and he could back off of a position, which is kind of interesting. And as long as there was a way for him to save some face and feel like he had a degree of respect. Condi Rice, but what actually made those conversations work better is the fact that Powell had a deep military and intelligence background, which Putin had, and they could sort of connect on that. There was a degree of rapport around that class of experience. Condi Rice was a student of the Soviet Union, then Russia, spoke Russian, and right away the conversation was, you know us, and there was a sort of back and forth and how that would work. The really challenging one was, how do you deal with somebody who just can't stand you?
Mm.
And Hillary Clinton was in that category because she had to do a lot of stuff with Putin,
Yeah.
at the time. And, for example, get them to cooperate on sanctions on Iran with their nuclear program, or get an air corridor over Russia so the U.S. didn't have to go through Pakistan to resupply Afghanistan and so forth. Well, how does somebody who can't stand you, which Putin could not stand Hillary because she's a hardliner on Russia, how did she manage to connect and get some business done? And of course, the issues were one thing, but part of it was finding things that she could connect on with him. So she, for example, went to the St. Petersburg Memorial and started talking to him about it. And all of a sudden, that unlocked a story about his childhood and what he grew up as and so forth. And it was, this really, it's hard even to know whether it was true, but a story about before he was even born, how when the Germans were bombing and strafing and so forth, and her and Putin's father saw a pile of bodies that was being carried out in of the town, that people had fallen in the streets and so forth, and he recognized the shoe of one of these people and said, "That's my wife," and argues and actually pulls her out of the pile of bodies. It's his mom. It's Putin's mom, and he's alive. She's alive. And Putin has told this story, and he sort of, and then the conversation went. Now, whether that was true or not, I've queried a lot of Russians about this, and apparently it was true. But it also sort of broke the ice. And then at another situation, she complimented him on his efforts to conserve large Siberian mammals like the Siberian tiger and so forth. And instead of this kind of surly, menacing guy that he often was with her, all of a sudden this kind of opened up. And these are seemingly irrelevancies, but in the same way that the guy you were talking, Jim Fish, I guess, was talking about, something tragic happened to him. People could relate on a personal level because their moms and their
Yeah.
families and so forth. How can you find elements or areas of rapport? And actually, research is very helpful. But you can find out a remarkable amount of things these days on open source social media.
Yep.
You find out people's interests, areas, and so forth. And I've actually in my advisory work found that to be really helpful. You can learn much more about somebody than just what's in the deal. And secondly, you can often find people who are influential for that person. And you can then, as if it expands out and becomes important, you can use social media to mobilize supporters, to thwart potential blockers and so forth. And that really wasn't available so many years ago. But I was advising on a deal in Mongolia recently, and of all the crazy things, we got some really valuable information out of social media
Huh,
in Mongolia. You would think I didn't even know they had
that's funny.
these just,
Yeah,
and let alone.
and in a minute I'm going to ask you because we only have a few minutes left to we can talk about maybe some techniques and tactics and strategies for
Sure.
negotiating. But there's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, I believe. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it, but it also
I haven't.
reminds me of a lot of that kind of stuff because basically his job was to go into these different governments and to try to convince them to give us resources, whether it's oil, so that the United States would then come in there and help them build infrastructure. And these companies would go, or these countries would go into a lot of debt to the United States, and the debt would be paid off by us getting access to their natural resources. And so,
Hmm.
but at the same time, we would be funding their infrastructure, creating dams, canals, electrical grids, plants, all that kind of stuff. But they'd be in debt to the United States, and we have unlimited access to their oil or whatnot. And it's just really interesting to hear how he would go in and negotiate with these politicians in Saudi Arabia, in Latin America, in Asia. And again, it reminds me about some of the things that you're talking about here. But I want to shift gears a little bit for us to talk about some techniques or strategies that leaders can use, because a lot of people who are listening and watching, they are leading a team or a function, or maybe they're an individual contributor. And so, let's say I'm a leader and I'm trying to convince my team to move in a direction, or I'm an employee. I'm trying to convince and negotiate my leader to let me work from home 2 days a week or to get a salary. Are there any tactics or steps, like maybe 3 to 5 things that are pretty consistent across negotiations that people should kind of have in their arsenal?
Yeah, I would say, one thing that I won't even give it a number because it's so important, but you really want to know what it is, what your interests are and what you're trying to satisfy. Because that's not always obvious. And if I think of some of my MBA students, for example, when they're negotiating for a job or the compensation package or otherwise, the question is, what are your real interests here? Is to maximize your comp, or is it to be put in something that will leverage and build experience and credibility so that you'll be able to rise faster and have a, broader sweep? Which is more important at this stage in your life? And I would often say that subject to the comp being competitive, that's probably less important than the kind of mentorship, the frequency of evaluation, it's really understanding your own interests. It's not just, I want to get more on, this dimension. And many times, and you'll also find that, suppose you have a client who wants to take over a company, and it makes sense, and so you get into the process, and then actually you realize that taking over the company is not nearly as important as some key IP and 3 engineers. That's
Hmm.
what you really need, right? In other words, so again, sort of knowing where your real interests are rather than the thing that pops into your head that you'd like to get. That's important. I think in some ways that's really obvious, but you often see that it is not, people don't do it. The second thing, again, in the super important category is, have you really thought about things from the perspective of the other side? What do they care about? There was an Italian diplomat, um, Daniel Vare, who said, negotiation is the art of letting them have your way.
Mm.
And that sounds very cynical and manipulative, right? And there is a version of that that's exactly cynical. But there's another reason. If I say, why do you say yes to something? Do you say yes for your reasons or for my reasons? And obviously, you say yes for your reasons. And so the better I understand how you see the world and what your interests are and your constituencies, the better I can shape your choice such that what you choose in your interest is what I want. And that requires, sometimes less effective negotiators. I'll run into who say, hey, that's their problem. Let them deal with it. Here's our problem. And to me, that is often very short-sighted because what you really want to do is get them to decide to do something that you want. And the best way to do that is to understand who they are, how they see the world, what their constituencies are. You know, it's interesting because a lot of people think of their opposites of sort of empathy and assertiveness.
Hmm.
And empathy, not sympathy, but empathy, the capacity to sort of inhabit somebody else's, mind, if you will, and their feelings. But that's important both for them to feel heard and for you to be most effective at influencing their choice, the better you understand them. You also have to be assertive, but that doesn't mean you have to be brash or in their face. It just means that your interests have to be clear and you're comfortable asserting them. Those two, in my experience, go together. And so how and you also want to know the kinds of things, people's hot buttons, or I often ask people when I'm assuming people have done the kind of analysis that you would if you were, going to propose a project or something. But it's often important to think about the hardest question that you might be asked. In other words, what is it that will you feel might be most awkward to be asked? It could be something as simple as, what's the maximum that you're going to willing to pay
Yeah.
for this? And you should be ready to answer a question like that. Or maybe you're younger and someone says, I like your idea, but aren't you pretty young and inexperienced to take on a role of that kind? Or it could be because you're female, or it could be because of lots of things. Have you thought about, is that question isn't tactically difficult, but it could be emotionally triggering, right? And so how are you going to answer or think about that? And I find that a list of kind of the hardest questions that you might be asked and think through and actually verbalize answers. And if you feel like you're stuck, ask some people, because a lot of times what feels really hard to you talk to somebody else and they say, why don't you do this? And it's, oh yeah, good idea. Because you get kind of locked in your own way of seeing things and so forth. So this is, I mean, again, these are sort of interpersonal pieces. But I would say, really, even in small scale negotiations, setting up a negotiation is often very important relative to just how you're going to directly persuade the other side. So, for example, you have, you know, you're 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 a supplier and you've got something that you want to sell, and there's the buyer that's on the other side. Well, you're going to deal with them, and you hope you can be persuasive about how it'll meet needs and so forth. But frankly, oftentimes they're measured on the basis of how much they can knock you down from your initial price, and they really want to squeeze you on this, and you would like to go forward. Well, your best advice is often to have spent significant time with the people in the company who plan to use what it is that you're hoping to sell, and persuading them
Mm.
of why it's superior to what your competition is, which presumably you know pretty well, and even letting them use it for free, so that they get hooked to it to some extent. Then they, in turn, if you've chosen somebody who both will profit from what it is that you're trying to sell and has some political weight, then that's going to be much more effective with the buying agent than what you can deal with directly. So you may want to say, I should set this up a little differently than just how do I think about me versus the person on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
Again, that's a very minor example of setting something up, but I would say know your interests, understand the other side, think through the hardest question, and what the form of persuasion that's likely to be most helpful. The other thing is, you really, I think one of the most important, it's very commonly said, but it is really important, is the difference between the positions that people take on issues and the underlying interests that are driving those positions. And this,
Mm.
people often confuse positions. You say, here's my position, here's your position. And maybe if they converge, you have a deal, and if they don't, you have an impasse. And that's a sort of a classical way of looking at negotiation. But usually, the most effective negotiators are looking behind those positions and saying, what are the interests that are driving those
Oh.
positions, and can those interests be reconciled? And so, I mean, there's a bunch of classic examples, but the one that people think of is, two sisters quarreling over an orange, right? Each one of them says, I want three-quarters of it. Their positions are incompatible because there's just one orange. But if you probe behind those, and one of them is really hungry, and the other one needs flavoring for a gourmet recipe, it's an easy problem. Peel the orange, give the peel to the one who needs the flavoring, and the fruit to the other who's hungry. Right? In other words, it's a simple example, but you find this
Mm.
in a lot of other settings. I remember early on in Blackstone's day, uh, Pete Peterson and Steve, though they were sort of masters of the universe in the advisory world, when they went into the principal business and they were trying to raise money to invest in the early days of LBOs and so forth, they they sent out 500 letters to
Wow.
former clients and friends and so forth. They got a lot of encouragement and no investment. And so they chose 17 of what they thought were the highest likelihood prospects. They met personally, 16 turned down, and one conditional investment from the Prudential Insurance Company put up 100 million conditional on others putting in a certain amount and so forth. And they were almost out of ideas. And Steve really had this notion that the Japanese had a lot of capital and maybe they would work. So they hired some bankers who were really familiar with Japanese pieces, got some with great difficulty got meetings with some Japanese companies like Nikko and Nomura and so forth. But the bankers had said they're never going to do this because the Japanese invest in short-term things. They don't tie up money in long-term illiquid investments like private equity and so forth. So it's just not going to work. And we don't even want to set up these meetings because it'll damage our relationships with these people. But they persisted. And Steve, made the private equity pitch, and he's very persuasive and so forth. And his Japanese counterpart basically says, no, we're not interested. Why? Well, it's profitable. Yes, probably will be. Good luck. But we don't do that. And so, and you could try to re-explain it
Yeah.
or this or that. And so Steve actually, what he did was really quite interesting. He said, okay, let's put this investment to the side. Let's forget about that for the moment. What are you trying to do in coming to North America? What are your plans and your objectives? Because this was the time, this is actually in the late 80s and early 90s. A lot of industrial firms from Japan, Toyota and Mitsubishi and so forth, had come to America, and the financial firms were sort of following them. And they were talking about, well, they're following their Japanese clients who are wanting to buy and sell, properties here and so forth. And, Steve was one of the world's best M&A bankers, and he said, what about if we formed a joint venture? Well, we'll teach you because you guys are not going to be successful at mergers and acquisitions because it's technical and your language skills aren't very good and you don't have all the high level relationships. So what if we were to form a joint venture where we'll teach your guys how to do M&A
Mm.
and you consider investing in our fund?
Yeah.
Very interesting. That led them to Tokyo, ultimately to an investment, a series of investments. And there's a fascinating story there. But the idea was the positions. We want you to invest. No, we're not going to. We're incompatible. If you had open-ended questions, then you might discover a way where you could find something of high value to them and low cost to you, and something of high value to you and low cost to them. And that's exactly what they ended up
Yeah.
doing.
That's
And Steve basically says that's what actually that was what made Blackstone.
yeah.
That
That's an
particular
interesting
deal
approach.
linked with some others.
Yeah, I love that, and I think those tips and techniques are pretty straightforward and helpful for a lot of leaders out there. And you're right. I don't think a lot of people spend time understanding what those are and even defining them. I'm even thinking in my life how many times when people try to negotiate with me, if I really have insight into
Yeah.
what those elements are. Where can people go to learn more about you? I know you mentioned your podcast. Is there anything else that you want to point people to?
Yeah, I launched Dealcraft last September, which is to say it's barely been 6 weeks out there. And the reason I did is I, had a career full of dealing with really remarkable negotiators. This podcast is called Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators, and it involves all the people that we've talked about, a couple of episodes on some of Steve Schwartzman's top deals, some of the secretaries of state, Michael Jackson's lawyers. I mean, just a whole series of things, which I think are both cool deal stories, and I try to extract insights that'll be valuable in practice. So that's kind of fun, and I'm excited about it because it's gotten a nice reception, and that's a place that people could go. I would also say I've written about half a dozen books, but the book that I think would be most valuable to people, especially in leadership positions, is is called 3D Negotiation. And that's a book that I wrote with my colleague and friend and business partner, because I have an outside advisory firm. And that's where we really flesh out with lots of examples from our experience and otherwise of what it means to think of not just tactics, but also deal design and setup, and the moves
Hmm.
away from the table as well as moves at the table, and how you can get from here to there. And so I think it's especially systematically looking at all the moves away from the table, how you get the right parties involved in the right sequence, under the right set of expectations to deal with the right issues, by the right process,
Hmm.
critically facing the right consequences in the event of no deal. And you shape those so that when you're at the table, you've got the best chance of realizing the potential of the
Ah,
agreement.
very cool.
And you know, and this all the setup, deal design, and tactics. And I think particularly as one moves into leadership roles, and there are more and more stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, and also synchronizing internal negotiations productively with external ones.
Yeah.
We often find in our advisory work that people will say the internal negotiations are as or more difficult than the external ones, you know, because the internal process is
Yeah,
often all
yeah,
the
yeah.
gates you have to go through and so forth. And so many times orchestrating that more productively is really the key to getting better outside deals. But the sort of setup, deal design, and tactics, where you then systematically assess what the barriers are, especially where there are many stakeholders and you're trying to align them with the strategy that you have in mind, this is tailor made to that. Whereas advice interpersonally and tactically, which is, we've talked about that a lot already here, or if you read Chris Voss, for example, you really get a lot of insight into that piece. But how you put the pieces together in
Yeah.
a larger sense is, I think, the distinctive contribution. And most of it is stories, because
People love
people learn from
stories.
stories and examples. And then you step back, and I think I've been a little heavy on the concepts and less heavy on the stories with you. But I hope that I hope that it's at least helpful and stimulating for the leaders that you deal with.
Very cool. I'm sure it will be. Jim, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for listening. I hope you check out his podcast, Dealcraft. And Jim's pretty easy to get a hold of, so you can Google him and see all of his information everywhere. Jim, again, thank you so much.
Well, Jacob, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. If you want to get access to more content on how you can become future ready, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. It's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.